Good afternoon, and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinars. I'm Brian Gilbert, and I'm thrilled to kick off another episode of NCIA's Committee Insights series today, our longest running and premier educational program produced in partnership with NCIA's 15 member-led sector-specific committees. For today's program, members of NCIA's Risk Management and Insurance Committee have convened a panel of cannabis regulators and legal experts, alongside leading event and hospitality operators, to provide the inside scoop on new regulations being adopted to manage cannabis consumption establishments. So if you found yourself curious about the regulatory trends and frameworks or risk management and insurance mechanisms being created to protect these businesses, then you're in luck. Our panel will dive deep into these cutting-edge regulatory structures, and you'll be able to learn from those operating directly in the space across the country with our panel of experts. But as I mentioned, don't forget this is an interactive experience, so don't hesitate to post those questions throughout the session, and our panel will address during a dedicated Q&A period before we close it out. All right, enough with the intro. Kick things off, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's program, Matthew Grimes, a long-running member of NCIA's Risk Management and Insurance Committee, as well as the newly appointed Director of Operations over at Oregon Cannabis Association. Welcome to the virtual stage today. Great to have you here, Matt. How have you been doing over in the Pacific Northwest these past few months?
You know, I haven't quite gotten there just yet. I've been busy trying to sell a home here in Chicago. I've lived here now for 24 years, so it's packing up a life and grabbing my dog, and we're going to dip out to Oregon. I'm super excited about it, and I couldn't be more honored and thrilled to serve the industry in this new role. And so I want to thank all of you out there who have taken your time to join us today. I think this is a very important topic for our industry, and I think that you'll be pleased with the conversation and the discussion that we have today. We have assembled a dynamite panel for you guys. And with that, I would just like to get right to it and introduce our panelists. And forgive me a little bit, I'm going to read these because these guys are great and they have substantial bios. First up, I would like to introduce Jody Green. Jody is a business and litigation attorney in Miller Nash's Los Angeles office, focusing on legal issues faced by the cannabis industry, as well as policyholder insurance recovery. Jody's a leader in numerous cannabis-related organizations, including the NCIA's Risk Management and Insurance Committee, the Executive Committee of the Los Angeles County Bar Association, Cannabis Section, and the Advisory Board of the CNIGMA. Super Lawyers named Jody a rising star in insurance coverage for 5 consecutive years. Jody is also a prolific author and commentator on cannabis issues who published an online course on, quote, managing the risks of cannabis-related businesses, quote, for ALM. She is also a dynamic public speaker, and I can attest to that, who frequently appears on podcasts and seminars hosted by organizations such as the NCIA, the ABA, the Defense Research Initiative, and a dozen others. And so thank you, Jody, for spending your time to be here. Everybody, Jody Green. Next up, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you guys to Andrew Brisboe. Andrew was elected to serve as the CANRA president in 2021. That is sort of a Federal Association of State Regulators in the cannabis industry. Andrew was appointed by Governor Whitmer to lead Michigan's Cannabis Regulatory CRA in 2019. The agency oversees the commercial licensings under the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act and Michigan Regulation and Taxation Act of Marijuana Act as to establish, this gets a little jumbled here, folks, as to establish Michigan as a national model for a regulatory program that stimulates business growth while preserving safe consumer access to marijuana. Safe consumer access to marijuana. Brisboe has also been in licensing and regulation with the state of Michigan since 2004, including experience with the Michigan Gaming Control, Department of State, and the Occupational and Health Professional licensing. For all of you anticipating interstate commerce, OSHA regulations, you should know them and get familiar with them. And finally, I would very much like to introduce our Andrew's a special guest, but it's really a thrill to have Tatiana here with us today. She's super busy. She's celebrating her child's birthday party today. She's taken the time out to share her story with all of us and to, again, spread the word about consumption lounges, public safety, public health, and then her experience in Michigan with, wrangling with the regulations. Tatiana is a Metro Detroit native who has had an entrepreneurial spirit since a young age. After working in the corporate world, she pondered the idea of starting her own public relations and event planning committee, and Infused PR and Events was formally formed. Luckily, Grant had built up a strong network of friends, family, and acquaintances who supported her in her business ventures. Infused PR and Events is now one of Michigan's top PR firms and offers premier public relations and event planning services to celebrities, small businesses, nonprofits, and of course, corporations. Under Grant's influence and execution, Infused managed sponsorship relations for clients and has managed approximately $10 million of these transactions for their clients to date, and this was written a while ago. The company has also grown its client base from professional athletes, who were the only clients at first. They had a sort of a sports focus, and now have advanced it to small businesses, nonprofits, and corporations. The Infused team has secured an array of local and national media placement for their clients. And with that, thank you again, Tatiana, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to kind of share my journey. One thing that isn't in that already long bio is kind of my journey into cannabis. I started wanting to become a secure transporter. And then upon going down that pathway, was encouraged to stay in the marketing and event space. A couple of months after exploring that, the then MRA released emergency rules stating that there was a new license type. Actually, I believe the two that we're talking about today, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, were the event organizer license, the special event permit, and then is that when the consumption license became available too?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Got it. And so I started doing a SWOT analysis and figured if I wanted to be strong in the industry, I was going to need to obtain that license. I applied, and I think the third day after it became available, to Director Brisbo's credit. I was able to get my license approved in a matter of weeks, and before Christmas, obtain that license, making us the first company in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan to obtain that license. We were supposed to produce Michigan's first licensed cannabis event March of 2020. We all know what began to happen then. I got a very appreciative call from Andrew's office asking me to withdraw my application. And I did that immediately. And within a matter of days, I think it was actually the next day, we were told that the state of Michigan was banning events because of the pandemic. So since then, and during that process, I had the opportunity to become Michigan's first, which anytime you're first comes with a lot of learning curves. And so during that process, just learned about the paperwork that is required. Luckily, the municipality that we were working in had said yes to produce events, and we had the support from them, so that it was a little bit of an easier journey to get the paperwork into the state. During that process, we learned a lot that was needed, especially on the insurance front, that I'm sure we'll talk about later. But yes, long story short, we ended up having to cancel it. And since then, have been in and operating in the space, but I have not utilized the license thus far. We have a couple of partners where last month maybe it was June. It was either June or July, we produced an event at a consumption lounge called Hot Box Social, which is in Hazel Park. We have another event at that same consumption lounge next week. So I do also have a little bit of experience in producing events at consumption lounges as well.
Sorry, unmuting. Wonderful. Thank you, Tatiana. That's just a fantastic story. And so can you talk about like maybe some of the specific challenges that you've had to overcome with your business?
Yes. So, initially, one of the challenges that, again, thanks to Director Brisboe, we were able to kind of get through was one of the attestations that was required. And the way Michigan is if you don't have everything in a row for the regulatory agency to look at, your application gets sent back as a notice of deficiency, and you have 5 days to remedy it. So you pretty much want everything to be together, because if not, you're on the clock, essentially. So one of the issues that we had was, as an event organizer at the original time, there was some stipulation, some paperwork in there that said that me as a licensed event organizer, I took on the responsibility of product liability. And at the time,
or Andrew, I believe that's attestation J, is that right? Or is that just for insurance?
it was D.
It was D, okay.
And it depends on which license type it is in Michigan.
Fair enough. For insurance, I think it's attestation J that applies, but regardless, don't let me interrupt you. I was just talking. So thank you, Tatiana, for bringing that up.
It's okay.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, it brings up slight PTSD because of what we ended up having to do with it. So at the time, because of the time constraints and things of that sort, we just had to roll with it and say, okay, even though it doesn't make sense for the event planner to take on the product liability, we're gonna do it. And essentially, I was thankfully asked by Director Brisboe to be on a work group, and in a self-serving manner, that was one of the recommendations that I put on the committee, was how can we change this to make it a bit more fair to event organizers in the state of Michigan. The event organizer license is one, I would say, of the easier and more affordable licenses to obtain. And part of that liability and insurance costs associated with it could be prohibitive to certain people looking to get their foot in the door in the 100%. Industry. And so about a year ago, Director Brisboe kind of asked me, he said, did you see what I announced today? And I was actually at a conference for the association in Michigan and did not see what he was referring to, but it was the fact that he was able to change the rules to basically accommodate that, to make it make sense. I don't know if now is a time for him to share what the rules change was, but it seemed to have remedied the part that didn't necessarily make sense from a liability perspective at the time.
Yeah, no, thank you again. And we'll get to that. We'll go to Andrew here next. And I think that maybe Jody can offer some insight when it comes to insurance and umbrella coverage and how it all can attach to their, I'll let Jody speak on it, but there's something to be said there as well. So she'll be back at the end, or if you'd like to offer commentary right now, that'd be fine too.
Whatever makes sense, I can take on at the end about the insurance and let Andrew kind of talk through, how we came to what we have for Michigan. I'm curious, so I'd love to hear from Andrew on the development of the regulations and everything.
Perfect. Well, with that, again, we're back to our very special guest today, Mr. Brisboe. Would you please take the floor, or take the mic? The floor is yours.
Sure. Well, pleasure to be here as always. Always appreciate the collaboration with NCIA, both from the state of Michigan perspective and from the CANRA perspective. As was alluded to in my intro, I've been at the helm in the state of Michigan in this wild and crazy cannabis space for about 5 years now, really since commercial legalization. And our agency is kind of a one-stop shop in Michigan. We oversee our patient registry as well as licensing and enforcement processes for both the medical and adult use markets. And I think one of the unique opportunities we have in Michigan is the flexibility in state policy. And Tatiana kind of mentioned this before, that some of the license types that we have in the state are done through our administrative rule process, not designed by statute. And having a lot of flexibility in our statutory framework, both the medical, which was enacted by the legislature, and the adult use, which was a ballot initiative by the people, has been really a great opportunity for us to explore and develop new innovative ideas and to ensure that the program is evolving as the cannabis industry itself evolves. And some of the license types we initially created, and we've created some others, include that marijuana event organizer, temporary events, and designated consumption establishments. As I took on this role, I relied heavily on my counterparts in other states, like Jim Burak from Colorado and Rick Garza from Washington and Steve Marks from Oregon, to kind of understand and learn what was already there. And those collaborative conversations really led to the founding of the Cannabis Regulators Association, which is now a coalition of 40 plus states. I think we might be up to 45 now. Essentially, every state that has a legalized program is either a member of our organization or on the cusp of being a member. And it's really a great opportunity for us to talk about existing issues and best practices, and also to be a voice at the table in conversations about federal policy reform, so that policymakers and federal regulatory agencies can understand the perspective of state regulators. The primary message we're trying to get across is we're the only ones in the country that have ever had to usher through, from a governmental standpoint, from the era of prohibition into the era of legalization. And there's a lot to be learned from that. And that's certainly something that is likely to happen on the federal level at some point through some vehicle, whether it's piecemeal or more holistic reform. And we want to ensure that our expertise can be leveraged in those conversations. So as we were working through those foundational elements of our organization and we were building out the program in Michigan, because of the expertise that we had from our state counterparts, we were able to understand how to implement the program as best we could, but we also recognized the emerging issues that were coming about, especially as we were implementing the adult use program. And the concept of social consumption in its various forms was one of those leading issues that we decided just to tackle head on in our first round of rulemaking through the creation of these licenses, knowing full well that there was going to be a lot to learn, and it was likely something we were going to have to continuously revisit. And when Tatiana says that, she was wrangling with the regulatory agency, what she really means is she'd call and yell at me whenever there was some policy that she didn't like, so she could make sure that we fixed it to her liking. And we've really taken an approach as an agency that as long as we can ensure there's consumer protection, then we want to be friendly to the businesses so they can operate and succeed, because that's what will diminish the impact of the illicit market and will ensure that consumers are accessing products in the safest way possible through the regulated market. And as Tatiana mentioned, the issue of having to learn and grow in this new space of social consumption through events and designated consumption establishments in Michigan, the pandemic really just exacerbated that, because they really didn't get going. So we're really just now starting to see the proliferation of these kind of events, and we only have 2 DCEs licensed in the state at this point. I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs who were sort of wrangling with the idea of how to make them a profitable business. I think our job was to open the door and let entrepreneurs do what they do and be creative and innovative and listen to their ideas and try to engage in policy making that supports the business development there. And as Tatiana also said, we've really taken the approach to engage with stakeholders, business owners, consumer groups, industry groups, so we can understand what challenges they face and where there might be opportunities for us to develop good policy that is supportive of business development and consumer safety. And the interesting thing that I think about marijuana event organizers as we crosswalk one of the other key issues in this space with social equity is, in the state of Michigan, 10% of our license holders in the adult use market are social equity qualifiers, but 33% of the event organizers are social equity qualifiers. So it sort of underscores what Tatiana said, that is a more attainable license type because the overhead's lower. You don't need a physical structure. You don't necessarily have to have local approval in order to get that event organizer license as a prerequisite for temporary events. So that's exciting for us and informative as we look at policy making in that particular space. And as we sort of turn and start talking about insurance more, as a regulator, and I think this would be a perspective shared by my counterparts across the country, is we view things like national standards and insurance as complements to state level regulatory programs. So where we can sort of farm out some of that risk oversight and ensuring consumer safety through other vehicles, that's really helpful to us. It's one less thing for us to do. And Tatiana's absolutely right. We had a pretty robust insurance requirement for any sales of cannabis products that might be adulterated. And in the concept of temporary event space, initially we required that of the event organizer, even though all of the underlying licensees who are making sales were also required to have that same policy. So it was sort of it was unintentionally duplicating effort. And so we were able to quickly pivot and change the rules so that we say that sales at the event must be covered one way or another, either by the licensees or by the event organizer. And that way we can continue to make sure the requirements of the statute are met and consumers are protected, while making it a little bit more friendly to the businesses that are trying to be in that space. So I'm very excited to see what might happen here in Michigan in the coming months and years in the development in the social consumption space, and continue to make sure that policy can evolve so those businesses can be successful.
Wonderful. Thank you again for all of your work and dedication and really opening up the marketplace in Michigan and just embracing the next wave of sort of destigmatization and normalization of cannabis and cannabis consumption. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And Jody, when it comes to these pesky insurance requirements, I was wondering, would it be enough? And maybe Andrew, I don't know how you know insurance, but what if Tatiana collected a bunch of certificates of insurance from all these people that she's working with, maybe even had her named as a name or an additional insured on those policies, and then she could just buy an umbrella policy that would attach over the entire event? Is that a plausible course of action?
Yes, Matt, it is. That's a great idea. Why don't we tell everyone to do that? Yeah, I think, when we're talking specifically, and let's just make clear, we're talking specifically about events as opposed to brick and mortar type establishments, right?
Yep.
And I think what Tatiana was suffering with in that situation was, as an event organizer, she shouldn't be held responsible for any product failure resulting from any product that is being sold by anyone else on site. And that puts a huge burden on her and a huge cost to have, the premium associated with buying, that insurance product. A much better solution would be, again, in an event type setting for the product, for the event organizer, to obtain their own policy, a very general policy covering, any sort of liability on site, premises liability, right? If a person trips and falls, over something, right? The very obvious sort of thing. But as far as any product liability, she should be able to pass on the insurance requirements to the product sellers or the actual brands that are going to be providing products on site. And that would be the better way to do it.
Could she do that through her contract of engagement with those vendors?
Yes. The best way to do it is to include requirements in your contract. So if you're an event organizer, you'll have contracts with any of the vendors or any of the brands that are going to be on site. Ideally, these should be handcrafted contracts, so not like a cut and paste job, because cannabis issues are very, very specific, and there are some federal courts that won't even enforce a cannabis related contract. So lots of specific terms and conditions that should be included in any cannabis related contract. But on the insurance issue specifically, you would want to have not only an indemnity requirement, so that would say, for any injury caused by the sale of your product, you will indemnify me as the event organizer for harm, but also an insurance requirement that would say you're going to add me as an additional insured onto your insurance. And then as the event organizer, also very important, not just to assume that they're going to do that, but get copies of certificates of insurance as well as the actual policies, and give those to your lawyer, or ideally insurance coverage lawyer, to look at and make sure that they conform to the requirements imposed.
You can also use, Jody's exactly right on all counts. Also, if you have a sophisticated insurance brokerage firm whom you partner with to get your insurance, they should be able to help guide you along that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't I can't say it enough, right? That cannabis, the cannabis industry, it is so unique, it is so specific that you have to have a good team. That's really the first thing, is not just legal, but also, making sure that if you're looking for insurance, that your insurance broker or agent is well versed in cannabis specifically. Ask around, get someone who's well vetted. An insurance agent that's been selling, construction insurance for their entire lifetime and decides to just, do a one-off on cannabis isn't the person for you. It's super nuanced.
Right. Sage advice from our friend Jody there. Andrew, just back to you for a moment. when you're talking with all of the other sort of, whatever chief regulators in their respective states, what seems to be the primary obstacle to getting, consumption lounge or even event cannabis events through the legislature?
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of interesting conversations recently with counterparts in other states that are starting to consider policy in this, broadly speaking, the social consumption space. And I think honestly, there are a couple of major concerns I hear. One is just that perception. If you're a lawmaker, it still seems risky to allow for consumption. Now recognizing that consumption is happening, the question is just where can it occur? And most states have laws that restrict consumption in public. So these are really just designating how consumption in public can occur, where it can occur, and under what circumstances. The other one that's a little tougher to deal with, and it's one that we're examining in Michigan as well, is particularly for temporary events, but I think it can happen with designated sites as well, is what about polysubstance use? So if we have festivals that have a temporary event license in our state, they could potentially also have, a beer tent style thing going on. So, you do start to run into some of those public safety concerns. How do we address those concerns, ensure that people aren't driving while impaired, which is always a concern, whether you have any sort of controlled substance use at these kinds of things. But now it certainly bears examination now that there's the possibility there could be cannabis consumption as well as alcohol and liquor and other things at events as well. And generally speaking, anytime something is new, it just creates a little bit of reticence. And that could be local policymakers or state policymakers as well. They want to see how it's going in other states. I got a lot of interested calls when we first started doing temporary events. I believe we were the first state to actually codify the ability to do a temporary event. And then, like I said, we really didn't do one for about 2 years. So no one really, they would ask me, how's it going? I said, well, it's not going yet because you can't have temporary events in the era of COVID. So, I think they're looking for those lessons learned. I know when I'm testifying before our legislature, the first question they ask me is, how do they do this in other states? And so when there's no other state to rely on, nobody really likes to go first and take those chances, especially if you're an elected official, again, at the local or state level. You can't really afford to be wrong because it'll be used against you as you're, battling for re-election. So I think that's led to a little bit of reticence to adopt policies allowing for these social consumption mechanisms.
That's fair. My four primary, my cardinal objectives now with this new job there are four of them, but it's education, 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 and education. And so I really think that we can come at this, policy argument from a public health, public safety perspective. And there's, real traction to be had there, the merits of that argument in favor of consumption lounges. And then on the other side of it, we do need some way to account for the potential for the crossfade with, alcohol and cannabis. And there's an operation out on the West Coast that I've gotten familiar with who has a sort of new technology where they can test for cannabis impairment on the spot. And so it's not if you've smoked yesterday or if you smoked, 3 days ago or indulged or engaged in cannabis in, whatever amount of time ago where it would normally pop on a drug test. It's going to go live, I believe, first quarter of 23, but they're going to be able to account for inebriation in the cannabis space specifically. So I'm really excited to see what they can do. And if you're not in touch with them, I would happily give you their information offline because I think that it'd be really helpful for the policymakers and the legislators to have that type of person in the conversation.
Yeah, that's 100% what we need to get that, to get legislators on the same page of having an accurate method for determining intoxication. I'm not a criminal lawyer, but this comes up in civil liability all the time, from an alcohol standpoint, and we're going to face the same issues with cannabis. How do we actually measure if someone's intoxicated? If there isn't any reliable way to do it. So Matt, I think that's really important.
So this is my friend and he's out there. This is like a public information. And Chuck, the name of the company, I didn't say it. I didn't want to but they're out there. You can find them on, if you know how to operate Google, you can find them. It's Buzzkill Labs. And I've gotten to know Jeff over there, and he's wonderful. And it seems like they're just going to shake things up. And importantly for us as an industry, we'll be able to get regulators and politicians a lot more comfortable with the idea of consumption lounge. And then we're right back to, public health, public safety arguments that will favor, I believe, in the end, consumption lounge arguments. And so thank you, Brian, for dropping the link in there. For those of you, there's a link. Go check them out. And I'm going to bring that with me to Oregon, and they're in California. But again, ready to go live, I believe, at scale, first quarter of 2023. And so here I am, maybe helping get the word out that that's available to us as an industry. When it comes back to consumption lounges, one of the very first chores I'm going to face going into Oregon is it's a heavy term for us. There's a big gubernatorial election coming up. We have a Democrat, we have an independent, and we have a Republican out there running. And the Democratic candidate is, as I understand it, now I'm getting this information from people who have been there and boots on the ground sort of thing, but she comes from a public health background and is using that lens to sort of argue against and be opposed to consumption lounges. And so hopefully we're going to be able to talk with them prior to, the November election. I really hope that that can be a tipping point for her to win, some of the independent vote, and maybe even some of the Republican votes. And that can be a nice little crescendo to her entire effort and help her win the governorship and help us advance the industry as a whole. And so, that's one of my very first tasks walking in. We got to hire a lobbyist, I think tomorrow or next week or something, but we're right in there with this. And so we're going to be out there on the front lines. And then a plug for NCIA's lobby days coming up, guys. I think, Brian, if you could drop a link in there, we're going to try and I'm going to try and get a few of the board members from the OCA, and we're going to go out there and, march with you guys, get in those offices and educate. And really, we're going to push consumption lounges, or at least I really hope that that's going to be the case, but certainly it'll be a talking point on one of the cue cards along the way. And so, Tatiana, I'd like to go back to you, please. I would love to hear about your future plans. What does the landscape look like for you going forward here?
Yes. So I am hoping to produce a large scale event within the city of Detroit next year, based on scheduling. So September 17th, we should be producing a non-cannabis event that we're hoping to make a consumption and sales event next year in Detroit. So just due to the timing and the permitting, it's going to have alcohol and not cannabis this year. But we have national acts, Fabulous and Pusha T. We have local rappers, Babytron and Peasy and some other acts. And it's going to be at the Russell Industrial Center, which people may be familiar because that's where High Times used to do the Cannabis Cup. And so, or one of the Cannabis Cups, probably one of the larger ones, the biggest one that they did in Metro Detroit. The other one they did was in a city called Clio, which is a couple hours away. So we have that next month. And, when we put our paperwork into the city, it was with the intention on it being a cannabis consumption event next spring. So, just from a business model perspective, the time and energy that it takes, the resources from a financial perspective, it doesn't make sense to me to do smaller events. So when Andrew was talking about me calling and yelling and things of that sort, a lot of those things early on were when there was just a lot of people operating in the gray space. And I would say, Andrew, why did I make this investment? Unlike a lot of people, I actually don't qualify for social equity. So I'm I really did make an investment, into this. And there are people who have nothing, no license, nothing at stake, and they're producing events and they're promoting it on social media, and they're out here making more money than I am. And so, just from a business model perspective, though, I get it. The numbers don't make sense for you to be spending, tens of thousands plus dollars on an event for an intimate gathering of 50. The numbers just don't make sense on that. So for me, I'm really focused on doing 1 to 2 very large scale events. I come from professional sports. So, my thought process on what an event looks like is definitely large scale. And so that's kind of what is in the future. We have the honor and privilege of the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association also being our client. So we produce all of their events as well. So we have a legislative luncheon coming up for them. We have their holiday party coming up. Next year's conference that was just last week coming up. And we also work with cannabis brands in providing brand ambassadors. So promo staff, ambassadors that go into dispensaries and are doing bud tender trainings, that are doing appreciation events, grand openings, things of that sort is kind of where I'm finding is the better use of our time and energy, rather than just trying to do an event every few weeks or few months. It's just not worth it to me.
Right on. Thank you for that. Jody, we have a question. If you're able to get into the Q&A, there's a question from Mitchell there. And I think it'd be great if you could offer an answer.
Can you guys just read it to me?
Yeah, I'll read it to you. Hold on.
There's too many things in the chat. I can't find it.
So the question from Mitchell Colbert. Thank you, Mitchell, for your participation and for asking this wonderful question. This question reads as follows, Jody. Do you see DRAM shop laws coming to the cannabis industry to make bud tenders and businesses liable for third-party damages if patrons drive high? That's a great question, Mitchell. That is a fantastic question. Thank you for engaging, and please, Jody, take it away.
Thank you, Mitchell. Yeah, you teed up one of the things that we were going to talk about. And it's, it's something that everyone is asking, right? For obvious reasons, because this is such a parallel to the alcohol, bar and restaurant situation. I think the answer to that is maybe, but also let's set aside gram shop or DRAM shop completely. Under the common law of most states, let's assume there is no statutory requirements for anything at all under, DRAM shop or gram shop liability. The common law of most states has a negligence standard, which imposes liability on anyone that owes a duty of care to someone on their premises that, gets hurt or hurts someone. And so there's a real legal question if there isn't a statute immunizing the establishment for conduct for serving an intoxicated person. That there could be liability. And then to really kind of to back up and hit on the question head on, right? So for anyone that doesn't know what this is, maybe we should define it, right? What is gram shop and what is DRAM shop? So DRAM shop, is a system of liability that was imposed on purveyors of alcohol. And this goes back to the day when, the smallest amount of alcohol served was called a DRAM. And now they're calling it gram shop for the smallest, serving of cannabis that's usually sold. But the idea is that, DRAM shop laws were created to have a statutory requirement to impose liability on anyone who's serving someone who gets intoxicated and then leaves and then hurts someone. Some states have these laws that impose liability, and actually some states like Nevada, for example, have laws that immunize businesses. So they protect them and say that, even if someone does get intoxicated and you serve an intoxicated person on site and they go and hurt someone, that establishment is not liable. So the ideal situation would actually be for states to create immunizations against liability for establishments that are serving people, like Nevada has done. And Nevada has actually created a statute under its AB 341, which created its consumption lounge regulations that does exactly that. So I think, companies or, policymakers that are looking to do this would have a really good guide for looking at Nevada. Kind of a long-winded answer.
No, not at all. Thank you.
There's a lot to dig into there, and I could keep going, but I know we have 15 minutes left.
Yeah, we're short on time, but I love the train of thought. I think I agree with, all of your points made there. Andrew, sorry, please go ahead.
I was just about to say that was actually one of the reasons last year why, even though I could have done events, I think Andrew's going to speak on some of the changes that were made to my understanding. But at the time, it also wasn't worth it to me to do an event, because at that time, I believe that as a licensee, we were still criminally liable. I think there's been some changes thereafter, but at the time, it wasn't worth it to me to have the potential of that liability being on me as a licensee as well.
Sure.
Yeah, and let me
that makes sense. And then, I'm sorry. Yeah, you get a couple lawyers on the panel. Hell breaks out, but no, or all things break out. Sorry, but I would love to go to Andrew and hear his comments on Mitchell's question.
Yeah, so Michigan did enact some DRAM shop provisions less than 2 years after legalization. So I think you might start to see that as a trend across the country as well. Jody's comparison to the alcohol industry is exactly why it happens. I think any state that doesn't have it, it'll just take one major lawsuit and legal challenge and publicity before that will occur. So Michigan does now have those provisions in statute, requires licensees who make sales to have a $50,000 liability policy related to that.
No, very good. And so, Jody, I cut you off earlier. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I mean, there's a lot of things in play here. I think one thing to think about, there's the question of, or the distinction between criminal liability. So there might be statutes that impose criminal liability and have criminal penalties on someone who serves an intoxicated person versus civil liability, which is a different thing, right? You can be sued as an establishment by anyone who is hurt, and the state isn't suing you, right? The government isn't imposing criminal penalties or putting you in jail, but obviously it's very important to protect yourself against both. And regardless of whether there's gram shop or DRAM shop, I did want to talk a little bit about, some of the things that companies can do to try to protect themselves from that liability. So I'm happy to kick that off.
Like, how do you protect yourself? Is there insurance available? What can you do from a risk management perspective?
Yeah, and I'm happy to kick this conversation off, and Andrew and Tatiana, if you have thoughts or comments too, feel free to please add on to my initial thoughts. But I mean, I think one of the, some of the big things to consider are, well, actually two main risks, two main sources of liability for, if we're talking, let's just talk about brick and mortar establishments. So if you're opening up a cannabis lounge, not just an event space, first of all, right, we have the issue of liability for intoxication, which we've talked about. And how do you protect against that? This is really something that goes into, in part, formulating a robust statutory scheme, which that's something that insurers like, and that can reduce insurance premiums if they know there are safeguards that are appropriate. So things to think about both for regulators and for operators, right? Consumer education. I think that's, number one. You have to think towards the lowest common denominator of who's going to come in to your lounge, right? You're going to see a lot of canna tourists, right? People who are novices, people who have, yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, like, let's talk about West Hollywood, that's my neighborhood essentially, right? Like, they are catering towards that. They want to be known as a canna tourism center. And so they've, licensed up to 16 lounges. Right.
Yeah, no, and, I think that Michigan has done a really nice job in that as well. I know of one like 4-acre event space that's coming online right now in Muskegon. And I think things are just about to get really live there when it comes to events and then consumption lounges. So I'm really excited to see this begin to blossom across the country.
100%. Yeah. And I think, certainly I'm not just talking about California, but, from my perspective, right, if you are a locality and you want to paint yourself as a canna tourism center, you need to be sure that any of the lounge operators or event organizers are, making sure that consumers understand what they're getting into if they're new, right? If you're selling edibles, right? Every one of us, I'm sure, has heard all of the horror stories from their friends or people who know that you're in cannabis and say, oh, that bad time that I had a experience with a pot brownie and I went into a coma for 2 days. You don't want,
that's not the consumer experience you
don't want that to happen.
Regulated market, right?
You don't want that to happen, right? We certainly don't want that to happen here. So we want to make sure that operators are carefully educating their servers about, operating procedures and how to tell people what to expect. Think about warning labels on products if they're being sold, about, making sure that the THC content is clearly labeled and clearly, told to the people like exactly what they're going to get. And that honestly, any edible products ideally are going to be fast acting nano formulations. It's not going to be a situation where they take something and wonder, oh, is this going to kick in? Actually, by the end of, the experience, they've sat there for an hour and they've just consumed 100, grams of something that they're going to get really high because it didn't kick in yet.
No. Sorry to interrupt, but just on that score, I'm very bullish on drinks. There's several companies out there, one in Michigan specifically, and another one in LA that I love. They've developed these robust flavor profiles. They have 2 milligrams of THC, 4 milligrams of CBD. So for the uninitiated out there, that's called the entourage effect when you get the two together. And it really means that 1 + 1 will get you 3. These come in digestible, like just consumption cans, any like beer or seltzer can. And once the consumption lounge is hit with the nano emulsion, the trajectory of your inebriation is similar to that of alcohol. But really, so you get to go out and you get to have all the fun, you know, but you get to skip the poison and keep the party. And I really think that once that's be able to be sold in bars and restaurants and sports venues, Tatiana, you know, I really think that given a choice, consumers are going to opt for that experience as opposed to alcohol. And we're going to, you know, really disrupt big alcohol in a big way with a lot of the stuff.
I'm with you, Matt. I'm totally bullish on drinks too. I love the drinks market. I just attended the Cannabis Drinks Expo in San Francisco. It was an awesome event. Got to meet a ton of operators. Not going to name drop anyone on this this webinar, but yeah, it's certainly something that's going to open up the doors to a whole new category of consumers. But we need to protect them and make sure that they're educated about the products that they're consuming so that they know. So, you know, some of the other things that lounge operators and, you know, event organizers too should think about, you know, requirements and waivers that people sign for, you know, agreeing to ride sharing and things like that. You know, if you're going to send people off the premises, ideally, you know, if they can agree in advance that they'll use ride sharing, that's a great protection mechanism for the operator to avoid liability later. So just getting all those ducks in a row in advance is going to save on the back end so much later, because we also have to think about not just an individual bad situation that might occur, but the effect that it might have on the whole industry. Because ideally, right, we're doing lounges, we're rolling out lounges to destigmatize the industry as a whole, to make it, you know, more welcoming to everyone, so that, you know,
public health, public safety.
Yeah, and so we have to be be cognizant of everything that any lounge is doing. Could, you know, if it's a negative experience, it could hurt the industry as a whole. So
100%. That's why we want this regulated appropriately with input from the operators. And I'm glad that Andrew touched on social equity operators. You're right, and 100%, Jody. You got to like do all this on the front end, but that comes like getting operating capital is a real challenge out there, and in particular for the social equity license winners. And so we really need to do everything we can in the legislation and the regulatory work to privilege social equity providers and veterans. And I think we have a lot of good models out there. I think they could be more robust, quite frankly. I think the industry was built on the backs of a lot of these brothers and sisters, and so we should really honor them as we begin to make billions of dollars in cannabis. We've got a couple of questions here, and so let me get to those. Question from Matthew: can you share more details on the 4-acre space in Michigan? Yeah, or Muskegon rather. These are my good friends. They are Fields Cannabis in Muskegon. It's kind of, I'm familiar with the area. I had spent a lot of time up in Holland, Michigan, and it is kind of a stone's throw or a quick walk from that farmer's market that's right there. You know, that place has 30,000 people a weekend on a good summer weekend, and they're going to be able to walk over and experience cannabis, and they're going to have a restaurant as well. So it's really going to be a beautiful thing. Again, it's a 4-acre event space. And so they're going to have, I mean, you name it, however you want to engage with the plant medicine. And so you can be out there, see a show. They might put on concerts. They might have yoga. They might, you know, they're going to do anything and everything that they possibly can think of. And anybody interested in hosting an event at that space, for example, can just get in touch with them. And if you can't find them right now, you can get at me and I can put you in touch with them. So I hope that answers your question, Kevin. Chloe, can we touch on regulations and insurance policies in regards to intimate THC infused meal events? So I'll go ahead and answer that one real quickly. The short answer is have it be a private affair, and don't, you know, you can still sell tickets and everything, like charge admission or whatever, but you won't run afoul of public consumption rules, at least not in Illinois. It's a private event. And so I'll let Jody go ahead and speak on that if she'd like to, and you too, Andrew, if you'd like, or Tatiana, and I'll see if we got more questions over here. We're running it. We got about 7 minutes, everybody.
Yep, I'll just say a few thoughts on that. Definitely, like everything, it depends on the jurisdiction where you're operating or wanting to operate. Most places don't allow on-site operations to include cannabis and food. So they allow you to have and sell pre-made edibles, right? But there's a lot of limitations, probably because legislators are a little nervous about, how far things can go and the testing requirements for ensuring exactly what is in the food and how to measure, the THC limits and things like that. So most places are not allowing it. Like Matt said, the way to get around, the public regulations is to just either create a private social club where you have members, are charged an admission fee to get in and, have access to your events. And I think, from an insurance standpoint, insurance would be tricky for that. Most insurance companies are still not writing insurance policies for cannabis lounges or lounge operations. I'm not sure about private events. I think that would even be even more complicated, just because insurance companies tend to like things that are well regulated and structured, and that they have the testing and they know exactly what to expect. That's just my assumption.
It's the pesky actuaries.
No, pesky actuaries, yeah.
I'm teasing around. When it comes to infused dining and private spaces, or private events rather, one of the very first things I met the CEO now of Fields Cannabis out at the NCIA convention in 2019, and talk about, this is an international conference, and I meet a guy who lives 2 blocks from me, and he had the vision to create an infused dining experience, and I helped him open that up, paper it up through the state and everything. But again, the answer was private events. And if you're out there, Chef David, at Chamba Life here in Chicago, you are a beautiful human being, and anyone should get in touch with them to see about infused dining experiences if you're in the area. And with that, we have about 5 minutes left. Let me double check on the questions here. Let's see.
I'm gonna let Andrew bust everybody's bubble and tell you what he told me about
private events,
about infused.
Okay. Andrew, please.
Events.
Well, I don't know why you got to put me on blast, Tatiana, but I'll answer the question anyway. And this is a very state-specific thing when you start talking about consumption, but in Michigan, we do stop short of allowing for the serving of infused edible products or the preparation of those products. One of the concerns we have is you start to delve into the health and safety issues related to food service in general and all the standards that apply there. And there are other bodies, and in Michigan, that's all regulated by local public health officials. So it just became a very complex area. We are not permitting that at this time. And the way that we've worked around some of these things, I saw some of the chat going on about the infused beverages. So sales in Michigan only occur through retailers. So one of our designated consumption establishments, that they put it right next door to their retailer. And I think it particularly will start to blossom when beverages are more ubiquitously available in the state, that we do have pretty high standards for beverages in Michigan as well. Because as a consumer, you go into the DCE, you make a purchase, it's tracked on the back end like it's a delivery from the store next door, which we also permit. So it's really kind of a crazy workaround to end up feeling sort of like a bar experience would. You would place the order as the consumer, and what you ordered shows up. It doesn't really matter to you that, practically speaking, that looks in our statewide monitoring system like a delivery from the store next door to this. But we permitted all that to occur in order to open up those pathways. Again, recognizing that people are going to do this consumption and they're going to engage in these activities one way or another. We either provide a regulatory pathway, or unregulated pathways will meet that consumer demand. But yeah, the service of infused edible products is not a place we're quite venturing to yet in the state of Michigan, though I know there are other states that have permission to do that and are examining that policy.
Yeah, we're absolutely gonna work on it. Again, as I sort of take over the reins for the OCA here, one of the issues that's facing our members specifically is that there's been a suggested, thank you very much, Andrew. There's been a suggested increase in taxes on the operators from I think 17 to upwards of 23 to upwards of a 10% increase. And what we're going to hope to offer, I think, in exchange, and I've got to talk with everyone on this, but what I'd love to begin negotiating around that with is that if they authorize even just consumption lounges as they stand, even if there has to be a delivery service model, that type of thing, and then no infused food, just really just smoke or whatever you can order legally through the regulatory apparatus. But if they were able to, in Oregon, license these establishments and then tax these establishments, the collective gain in taxes would be like 3.5 times what they're asking for as an increase on, incumbent operators. And so hopefully they'll see the wisdom in that type of thinking, and hopefully the OCA is on board with just that policy right there, but I think that they will be. And so we're going to try and really push for consumption lounges. It's part of my mandate in coming into this job. And so, guys, we are right up against the hour here. Remember that we're going to keep this room open. If anyone would like to stick around and have maybe a less inhibited Q&A, you'll just be kind of with us here on the panel, or whoever got the panel can stick around. And thank you again so much for tuning in. This is an important conversation, and hopefully we've expanded the dialogue around it here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian Gilbert.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you so much, Tatiana, Andrew, and Jody as well, for really diving deep into this really emerging landscape that's surrounding cannabis consumption lounges, temporary events, and the license structure surrounding that, specifically as it relates to risk management and insurance. I really think you gave a lot of really amazing perspectives. And as I said multiple times throughout the chat, thank you so much, Andrew, for doing your work on the actual regulatory side of things to not only recognize this as a viable business opportunity for so many people that, want a lower barrier to entry within this emerging industry, but also from the side of a harm reduction side of, understanding that these things take place, and that if you don't provide an avenue for them to be done safely and in an environment that can be regulated and controlled, they're going to happen in an unregulated and unsafe space. So really appreciate you doing all of your work within Michigan. And it was really great to hear that background about the development of the Cannabis Regulatory Association as well. So thank you for doing all of that amazing work across 45 states now to bring this enlightened approach to some of these places that are just coming online, might have made the mistakes previously in the past, and really, really appreciate that. So with that, like Matt said, we'll stick around for a few minutes. All of the panelists are going to go off screen while we go off into the outro, but we'll stick around and leave the room open for a few more minutes to answer any additional questions that you all might have. So please continue to carry on the conversation here in the chat room. Post any questions to the Q&A board. Any questions posted to the Q&A board will be what will continue the conversation from inside of our public blog post once we get the recording for today's session published, as well as inside of our members-only community platform, NCIA Connect. So if you haven't joined NCIA in advance of today's broadcast, do know that the best way to continue to carry on the conversation with our network of established business owners, partners, regulators, and these amazing committee members is by joining NCIA and gaining access to that members only community platform. And yeah, to your question, Chloe, just stay on the lookout via email. You should see a registration email come out in the next 72 hours that will link you to that public listing for our blog post on YouTube, as well as the dedicated members only section where you can carry on the conversation with the speakers themselves. And then with that, just before you all leave, just to sort of tie all of this together, we would love all of your all's participation with our upcoming 10th annual Cannabis Industry Lobby Days. This is our longest running and highest profile advocacy focused event. We had to take a break from it in 2020, as it sounds like a lot of us event producers here on today's panel had to take a lot of breaks from our plans that we had for 2020. But we're really excited to be bringing this event back to Capitol Hill later next month. NCIA membership is a requirement to attend. So if you have any questions about the most affordable way that you can secure membership, how you can leverage your membership through an annual package to ensure access to this upcoming event, as well as our next annual Cannabis Industry and Lobby Days taking place next spring, please reach out to myself at any time. I'll have one of our colleagues put some email addresses that you can use to reach anyone at NCIA to learn more about this upcoming event. We also do have some amazing and exclusive sponsorship opportunities that are still associated and surrounding this event. So if you're really trying to associate your brand with the positive momentum that this assembled group of cannabis leaders is going to create, you'll definitely want to sign on today. So feel free to reach out to anyone at NCIA following today's event to learn more about how you can support those efforts. And then just to tie this back into the panel, I do know, like Tatiana mentioned, that they do a lot of work with one of our partners, the Michigan Cannabis Industry Association. And as Matthew mentioned, he is the newly appointed operations director at the Oregon Cannabis Association. So I cannot stress enough to all of you all on here that if you are not a member of your state-specific association leading the charge for reform on your level, please join them today. Make sure to stay up to speed on all of those local activities that MICIA as well as OCA has up on their calendar. I know there's an amazing summer fair that OCA is going to be kicking off in Oregon that I wish I was going to be closer to attend, but it sounds like an amazing event. So don't support national advocacy, but first and foremost, support the boots on the ground that are doing the work across your specific state. All right. And with that, thank you all so much for participating in another Industry Essentials educational webinar. Head to the events section of our website following today's broadcast to secure your spot in all of our upcoming virtual and in-person events. We've got 3 webinars on the calendar in between now and our Cannabis Industry Lobby Days, and then we're going to be putting more on the calendar over the next few weeks. If you haven't already, make sure that you are signed up for our weekly Events Digest newsletter, which will keep you up to speed on all of our activities as soon as they're announced, and provide those supplemental resources to make the most out of your involvement with these sessions. As Matthew mentioned, we do have a specific podcast interview featuring Matthew and Jody that was published about 3 weeks ago. That's a fantastic way to dive a little bit deeper into some of the nuances surrounding the subject today. And we also do have a recently published blog post by Jody and another member of the Risk Management Insurance Committee that can really help you dive a little bit deeper on that side as well. So with that, a huge thank you once again to the members of our panel for presenting today's session, along with all of our audience members and our member business owners, which are essential in driving our organization's mission forward. As always, we'll leave you all with this end of event credit sequence highlighting those 25 plus member businesses that participated in this afternoon's session, alongside some personally produced musical stylings. If you don't see your company included in the slideshow, don't be discouraged. That just means that you need to head to thecannabisindustry.org/join following today's session to join the movement for a responsible and equitable cannabis industry. Enjoy, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar, and then later next month in DC for the return of our annual Cannabis Industry Lobby Days. See you all then.